Well, welcome everybody to this web seminar. Okay, today we have the pleasure to listen to Marc Mehu about facial expression, a gateway to affective semiotics. Marc is an associate professor of the Department of Psychology of the Webster Vienna Private University. His present research is on the complex interaction between facial expression and human language. According to his abstract, he will focus on multimodal sign emitted by the face, as well as emotional expressions. Okay. I want to tell you a little bit about the format of this web seminar. Generally, the speaker has around 40 to 50 minutes to speak, and then I will call each of the panelists, and you will have from 5 to 10 minutes to make your questions and remarks. And then at the end, Marc will wrap up and answer all the questions. So, because if we answer the question after each person, we might surpass the time there because we have about 2 hours. Okay, Marc, it's with you now.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me on this platform to present my research. It's a great pleasure to talk to all of you, and thanks for listening if you are elsewhere, and for future listeners also. So as Monica said, I'm associate professor of psychology at Webster Vienna Private University. It's a small private university, American university in Austria. So I'm based in the Austrian capital. We are a small university. I have a small lab where I study social interactions, mostly the nonverbal aspect. But since nonverbal behavior has been my research theme for about 20 years, I'm happy now to start looking at interactions with language. So for people who study linguistics and language, also realize the importance of nonverbal cues and nonverbal signals. It's the same way for people studying nonverbal signals. We really need to understand how it interacts with language. So I'm going to start with an introduction with where I talk a bit about the research in psychology and in ethology that's been done on facial expression. And then I will present a recent study that is basically under revision, and it looks at the relationship between facial expression and speech acts. So. Okay. So I will define myself mostly as a human ethologist, so person interested in the biology of human behavior. That's where I started looking at nonverbal behavior from an evolutionary perspective. So I organized my talk here looking at the three of the four questions that Nicholas Tinbergen came up with, actually revised. And these questions are looking at the phylogeny, so the evolutionary history of facial expression, the proximate causes, the mechanisms, the ultimate causes, so the function of facial expression. I will talk a bit about multimodal communication. Then, as I said earlier, I will present a case study where we we do a quantitative study, basically, of a single individual in a social situation. I will conclude with some thoughts on the implications of this research for the study of semiotics. So to start with, I'd like to basically give a bit of an outline about behavior. Behavior is in psychology and in ethology, of course, one of the main subjects of research now. There's been a bit of confusion about behavior. I've been reading a few times that, like people consider like preferences or complex cognition as behavior. I think it's important to keep this as a separate construct. Technically, behavior is an internally coordinated response, so it is something that is observable. In principle, it's based on, so it's an action or an inaction of an organism to internal or external stimuli. It does constitute the interface between an organism and its environment. It's therefore an essential aspect of an organism's life. Behavior usually has, usually when we think about behavior, we think of motor actions, of course, like movement. But behavior is also considered like a general set of specific actions. So, for example, people talk about parenting behavior, maternal behavior, paternal behavior, the number of like more general behavior, a set of behavioral actions. So you have this with behavior, you have this grading of detail that you can look at behavior. You can look at very fine grain detail like muscular movement to like complex patterns of behavior. Behavior is separate from cognition. Behavior is not cognition. Behavior is not decision. Behavior is not preferences. And it's always on, so we always behave. In fact, when we sleep, sleep is also a behavior, resting, etc., etc. So the important aspect of behavior is goal-directed. So most behaviors are somehow functional, and they basically get the organism, they help the organism survive and reproduce. So the four whys, so the four questions that Tinbergen emphasized in the study of behavior was that it's important to look at behavior at different levels. These are levels of explanation, so to say. When people want to know why does a person behave like this, then you can ask yourself about the mechanisms. What are the direct, perhaps neurobiological, contextual mechanisms that were involved in the production of the behavior? You can look at the development, so the history of the behavior over the lifespan. You can look at the evolution. That's looking at a broader range in time. So what's the evolutionary history of the behavior? How does the behavior, when has the behavior appeared in the tree of evolution? You can also look at the ultimate function. So that's the survival and reproductive issues that have been addressed by that behavior. And so it's important, like when we look at facial expression, to be able to understand at which level we talk about. For example, people tend to confuse mechanisms and functions, and then you have like debates, are year-long debates in the literature about whether their facial expression functions to communicate or to influence somebody. Good. So I wanted to talk a bit about, of course, when we talk about expression, facial expression, I did choose the title of this seminar intentionally wanted to look at, say, expression. Usually I would call this more of as a behavior, but I wanted to make more of a point here that facial expression somehow expresses something about the individual. So it doesn't have to be a specific thing like an emotion or a social motive, but it is something internal. And the reason is that reason actually can be traced onto ethological research. When people behave or animals behave in complex and uncertain environment, it's been thought that it would be adaptive to have, say, multiple courses of action kind of that are ready to come in case the environment changes unpredictably. as if like having some kind of having almost like two motivations running, or one in the background and one being more active, just in case the environment changes and you have to switch to another mode of action. So this seems to be a property of organisms. For example, you look at approach avoidance. Um, Organism can say approach a target, but then at the same time have some anxiety arising, and as the animal or the person approaches, that anxiety kind of can take over and determine perhaps a retreat, just in case the situation changes. So this process seems, in my opinion, is really is the foundation of expression, and where uh, organisms could technically change course of action at any given time. And this change can transpire somehow through behavioral cues. And that's where people have thought, well, ethologists have conceived expression as the communication or the outward manifestation of alternative courses of action. So what the organism could do in case the situation were to change. So from there, perceivers seems to have picked up on that and developed like mental models of the social world, and use these perhaps these intention movements as information to guide their actions, and you then start a coevolution between like impression formation and expression, whereby it is adaptive for perceivers to get an accurate perception of the social world, and then at some point it's also adaptive for signalers or expressors to let these perhaps tendencies come out. So at the end, the expressions, in my view, the expressions are spontaneous. So they're when it doesn't contain like voluntary behavior. So voluntary behavior is something else. Expressions are more perhaps automatic, as the impressions are. So people form impressions automatically without necessarily thinking, and but then from a cognitive perspective, you can interpret and make these impressions more accurate. Okay, so when we move towards facial behavior has a long evolutionary history. Right? We could say that basically Charles Darwin's work on the emotion of expression in man and animal really kicked off the scientific study of facial expressions. And many of the important theories in the field derive from his work, or have some kind of connections to his work. How we know that facial expressions have a long evolutionary history? It's enough to watch closely related species. And here I'm thinking of the work by Lisa Bridget Waller and colleagues, who basically cataloged very different facial expression in different species. Here I'm showing their work on chimpanzees. They did also some work on macaques, even beyond the primate order. I think they're looking also at other mammals like dogs, cats, etc. So this procedure basically results from comparative research on facial expression, whereby you see in different species the muscles responsible for facial expressions have some are homologous, so they share a common history. This is the phylogeny of smiling and laughter, according to Jan van Hoof, a Dutch primatologist, who here shows that so we see like the bottom of the graph, three different behaviors like laughing, like vocalized, and smiling, and also like some aggression behavior. And these kind of derive basically from older behavior patterns. And these, like if you move up, you see a species that is evolutionarily older. I mean, when evolutionary older, I mean here the common ancestor between human and that species can be found like further down the evolutionary time. And you see that here, I mean, that his hypothesis that smiling and laughter are based on more here, the chimpanzees, two different vocalization, so not vocalization, but two different behaviors. The open mouth, the relaxed open mouth, and the silent bare teeth. The silent bare teeth is also shared with the macaque species, the macaque genus. And further down the line emanates from the primitive mammal aggressive call or aggressive behavior. So the point here is that, like, through evolutionary time, different behaviors can acquire a different function. And so from starting with signaling aggression being co-opted or exapted, as the term says, into expressions of different motivational states. This idea was summarized by Sheriff and Tracy in a paper 2011, where they said, like, they claim that the expressions of emotions that we see today are exaggerated displays of physiologically adaptive components. That's, for example, if you look at eyebrow raises, the eyebrow raises, which are now part of our expressive repertoire, originate from a from a behavior that has a physiological function, namely a behavior that which function is to increase the visual field. And so even though at the time it was used in order to cope with the physical environment, nowadays it has been accepted as a communicative signal. This shows another line of evidence looking at comparative cognition, where here we have three different brains. In A, you have a human brain, common chimpanzees in B, and long-tailed macaque in C, sorry. And here you have the area that is pointed with the arrow is a part of the motor cortex that is responsible for mouth movement, the control of mouth movement. And you see that in this paper, with Sherwood and colleague, nicely demonstrate from a pseudo-architectural perspective. So looking at the architecture of nerve cells, if you look at the apes and humans, these cells have a lot more density, especially in some layers. And that suggests that there has been like evolution towards like a better control of our facial movement. The same idea is represented here, whereby in A you see a brain, like a model of the brain, like how our last common ancestor could have looked like. The brain like looks very similar to would be very similar to like the currently living apes like chimpanzees or bonobos. And you see the changes in B, be a human brain. different changes, among other things, in development of the frontal area, so the greater prefrontal cortex, and also a greater density of von economo neurons. And these neurons are usually longer neurons, and neurons that allow more connectivity between different brain areas. And that suggests that later evolutionary changes in the human brain involve like greater connectivity in between different areas of the cortex, of course, then of the cortex, but also other brain areas, so subcortical areas. And in relation to what I had presented before, suggests that some of these changes concern how we can use our face and our brain to communicate in more complex environments. That nicely drives me to the production mechanisms involved in facial expression. So here you see two images. So on the left, you see we're looking at the neural pathway that is involved in the stimulation of facial muscles. And something that has caught the attention is that there seem to be two different neural pathways stimulating the, like I say, upper face facial muscles and lower face facial muscles. In particular, upper face musculature seems to be innervated by both sides of the brain. So it's like an ipsilateral and contralateral connections are observed. On the other hand, lower face are largely stimulated by the contralateral stimulation. It means that, say, if you look at half of the face, so on the left side of the face is controlled by the right side of the brain, and on the other hand, the right side of the face is controlled by the left side of the brain. If you look at the lower face, the upper face seems to be controlled by both. Both sides seem to be controlled by both sides of the brain. It's unclear exactly what it means from a communicative perspective, but I find this interesting that there's different specializations, brain specializations for different areas of the face. You see here that, like on the right side, the facial muscles are kind of innervated by different branches of the facial nerve. The facial nerve comes out here behind the ear and then divides in multiple branches that are then coming to stimulate oral area, the mid face, or the upper face. This type of, I apologize for the low quality of the image here. It's an old study, it's an old paper, but it's very essential also in helping us to understand the difference in neural control of different expressions. Here, basically, you see a case where you have a patient who experienced damage in the cortex, in the motor cortex, and when he's asked to smile voluntarily, he can only move like one half of the face. But in response to pleasant emotion, seems to have a spontaneously symmetrical smile. So you see on both sides here that suggests different control for different types of smile. The table on the left, on the right, shows that voluntary and involuntary movement are controlled by different areas of the brain, with, as I said earlier, different innervation for the upper face and the lower face. So now the work, the reason why I present this is sort of like medical doctor or neurologists are aware of like multiple different conditions where different parts of the facial expression can be affected. And when there is observational work in psychology to inform about the way these muscles and these facial expressions are used, then basically completes the picture in our understanding of the psychobiology of expression. Oops. Okay, so I talked about the neurobiological mechanism, and let me talk a bit about the psychological mechanisms. So typically facial expression is, the production of facial expression is a combination of interaction between external and internal factors. Internal factors like personality appraisal, cognitive appraisal, affect programs, social motives. There's been a lot of papers written about what exactly internal factors are involved. External factors like by affordances, like general threats and opportunities in the environment and physical environment, also in the social environment. Cultural norms are also very important factors in influencing facial behavior and social incentives and threats. So the idea here is that the relationship between external factors and facial expression is mediated by how these how their facial muscles move, therefore they can regulate better their expressions. And also, of course, facial behavior influences then back the environment and the external factors. The dominant view about how facial expression are produced is that there are events and the environment. Upon the perception of these events, some kind of appraisal occurs and some affect program is triggered, and this affect program triggers a configuration of facial expression. Not just the face, but also some physiological changes and some vocal changes. So here, the idea is that there are some neural programs that release innate expressions. That's basically that's the main assumption of basic emotion theory. And these based on these expressions, then perceivers are able to understand and to perceive the emotional state. Now, of course, you will know that this view has been heavily criticized. One of the critics is by the component process model, looking at appraisal views and appraisal perspective on emotion, conceives the expression as a build-up or cumulative build-up of facial activations, and each facial activation is then triggered by specific appraisal results. So when an event happen, there's some kind of relevance check depending on the output. Some action unit is being triggered. Then another appraisal kind of triggers another action unit, and so on, to build up a more complex expression. This view has talked a lot more about the mechanisms and the kind of detailed mechanisms under the production of expression. Another view of facial expression is that facial movements are basically produced by the activation of social motives by the social environment. And so in a social situation, a person would perceive different aspects of different cues in the environment, and from there develop some kind of strategy that would involve signaling in order to get some social goals. I'm not going to the detail of this table. In fact, in principle, a behavior would not necessarily mean there's an underlying discrete emotion, but the behavior would mean that the person has some kind of social goal in mind that they want to achieve. At contextual factors or social factors, this is research I was doing some time ago, where we looked at different groups. So, for example, different social environments, and basically counted behavioral frequencies. Like here, we're looking at smiles, and here on the side, we know that we see that like smiling frequency depends on the group size. So the more people are interacting, the more smiling we observe. But also the age composition of groups. For example, people tend to smile a lot more when they interact with people of their own age, or, and that's the middle graph here, the situation, the type of situation. So the type of interaction. So here we're looking at a control interaction versus a bargaining interaction. We see that in the bargaining interaction, certain types of smiles are given more frequently, and this type of smiles that are influenced by a bargaining context are what people call more emotional smiles, like the Duchenne smiles, more intense, open smiles. These bargaining being done with friends. Oh. So later on, that's still looking at the psychological mechanisms underlying the production of facial expression. I started studying whether people have more control over certain facial movements. So most people actually can control most of their faces, but there's some facial movements are more difficult to control. And it seems that, for example, facial action units 1, that's the inner brow raiser, facial action unit 6, the cheek raiser, are fairly difficult to put on command. And that's different, say, for example, the frown, brow lowering, or the lip corner puller, that's the zygomaticus activation. These muscles are fairly easy to control. Later, we found that people are quite sensitive, seem to be quite sensitive to the activity of the muscles that cannot be controlled. And that we hypothesized is related to, is a mechanism to avoid deception. So another stream of research looking at this time the perceptual mechanisms was conducted by Rachel Jack and Philip Shins from University of Glasgow, and they were, well, the reason I'm mentioning this here is that this is a very impressive work on how we how we get to understand what specific aspects of the facial people react to when they make their classifications, when they make their emotional classifications. So here it's a nice way to study the mental models that people have about emotional categories. For example, here on the left, we see that for happiness, for example, the mouth seems to be like and for surprise, the mouth seems to be the primary facial area that people use. But if you look at fear or anger, the eye area seems to be more important. Different type of patterns they use present thousands of randomly generated sequences of facial action units, and ask the perceivers to classify the action units in terms of emotion categories. Then after having seen all these, having multiple subjects seen all these randomly generated facial actions, can find out which type of model, which type of face model are associated with, say, happiness, surprise, fear. Discussed here. The nice aspect of the approach is that they also look at the temporal dynamics. And it seems here, for example, surprise and fear are not necessarily distinguished at the beginning of an expression, but is then becomes then differentiated, at least in the mental model, later on with different activation of the face. So for surprise, it seems to be more the eyebrows, but then for fear here seems to be more around the mouth. Okay, this is also work by Jack and colleagues. I will not go too much depth in this. It shows basically when they apply this methodology to different people from different cultures, they could test the universality hypothesis, and it seems here that the 6 kind of basic emotions they've looked at lead to different results and different in a different population. That when they look at East Asian population, see there's quite some overlap in the mental models for these emotions, but on the Western participants, it seems that these mental models seem to be quite homogeneous. So that suggests perhaps there is no a universal mental representation of facial expression. This is just one study of many of the recent studies looking at the universality hypothesis that go against the predominant framework, saying that facial expression of emotion, at least their interpretations, are universal. This is the last study I want to present, looking at the perceptual mechanisms of facial expression. This is a study where we presented portrayals of emotion. We analyzed the facial action units present in these portrayals and looked at the influence of these facial expressions on different types of judgments. So dimensional judgments, also judging whether a person is positive, negative, excited, not excited, dominant, less dominant, and also on the emotion recognition accuracy, so whether the person can actually recognize the intended emotion. And it seems here that emotion recognition accuracy is related to facial expression, but this relationship is mediated by the perceived emotional dimensions. So it could be that from a psychological perspective, people perceive or make first attribution in terms of valence and arousal before they make attributions in terms of emotion labels. So the last question of the last Timbergen's question I will look at in this is the function of facial behavior. And so since basically Darwin, perhaps even earlier, the idea was that facial behavior functions to express some kind of internal state and to communicate this internal state to others. And we saw that in the basic emotion theory, the information that is conveyed by facial expression is believed to be about discrete emotional states, but there are other hypotheses, theories, like claim, for example, that the face conveys information about emotional dimensions, action tendencies, cognitive appraisal, social intentions, other mental states and personalities, implicit motives. So there's a myriad internal states have been postulated to be basically conveyed by facial expression. And the more research, I'm sure, the more states people will find. I must say most of the studies there are based on perceptual studies. So it's mostly, all the research is mostly focused on what the perception rather than whether the emotion is actually encoded or the social intentions are actually encoded in the face. Okay, I'm going to skip that. It's a different function of facial expression would be social influence. So the facial expression would either influence the mood, influence perception, impression management, or elicit behavior. And another function would be like the regulation of social interactions. That nicely drives me into the next topic, which is the relation between facial expression and language. So Paul Ekman in the 1960s wrote a paper where he explicitly mentions that facial expressions are not just signs of emotion, but are also used in conversations, for example, as a button to accentuate speech, or as question markers, or as emblems sometimes. And well, but the question there was, okay, so he tended to separate between the action units or the facial movements that were true signs of expression, contrary to action units or facial movements that were basically conversation regulators. And that sort of kind of created kind of two separate streams of facial signals, like some maybe socially, so some facial signals that would be determined by or triggered by social circumstances, and others by emotionality. So now it's perhaps it is not particularly useful to have this separation, because these are, from an observational perspective, the same facial movements. So it's difficult to pinpoint whether a movement is more automatic, spontaneous, or whether it is more like socially driven or socially controlled. And so there's a recent theory inside the psychology of facial expression and emotional expression suggests that the emotional expressions are actually also used in relation to language to have conversational roles. And this is the theory of affective pragmatics, where Andreas Carantino suggests that emotional expressions basically play similar roles like speech acts. They're not quite speech acts, but are speech act analogs, in that they are means of expressing, means of directing others, they are means of representing, they are means of committing to different courses of action. So there, the connection there is no longer this clear separation between emotional facial signals and conversational signals, but an integration of emotional signals into like the communicative functions. So the theory of affective pragmatics is based on speech act theory, and basically postulate that facial expressions or other emotional expressions play different functional roles. So not just communicating emotion, but also social to influence the social environment or in social referencing. And if we go back to speech act theory, and speech act theory, as most of you probably know, insists, or it's a theory in pragmatics, it insists on the idea that language or verbal utterances basically have two major components: propositional content that relates to the literal meaning of the words or the expressions, and the illocutionary force relates to the impact the utterance is meant to achieve. So like by uttering speech acts, speakers only mean to convey certain meaning, but also to have some social action on the environment. So there are different theories of speech acts. I'm going to look at source theory, and says that speech acts are differentiated by their purpose, but also by the mental state they express. Speech acts are then associated with some sorry for that. Perlocutionary effects that are basically the effects that speech act is meant to achieve, and by the mental states that they are being expressed. So speech acts would be then underlined by certain mental states. This is a taxonomy of speech acts that I take from Searle, 1976. So there are different types of illocutionary force, representative. So people, the person basically commits to express a statement about the state of the world. Directive, where the function is to get the hearer to do something. Commissive, what does the speaker commits to a certain course of action. Declarative, when the speaker guarantees some, by speaking, like executes a social action by the words that are spoken. Or expressive, like expressing some kind of psychological state or internal state. So in communication then, if speech acts have to be like functional, and if they are meant to communicate some mental state and to have some consequences, comes the question of how do listeners identify the speech, which type of speech acts, which type of intention the speaker has. And some have, in source theory, there are linguistic indicators. For example, lexical indicators, the type of verbs you're using, syntactic indicator, the type of mood, if you look at an imperative or an indicative, but also nonverbal indicators, for example, like an intonation in a voice, or for example, asking question with their intonation raise, perhaps also a facial expression. And that's this latter aspect that we did investigate. Before that, I want to show some research, some experimental research, one of the rare piece of experimental research looking at the role of facial expression as potential illocutionary force indicative devices. And this is a study conducted by Domaneschi and colleagues, where they use the facial action coding system to produce different stimuli. And they associate these stimuli with different demands or different speech acts. And so in a production and perception study, first they ask the person to speak these speech acts. And they also then ask perceivers to read or to see if they can detect or understand the intention based on the stimulus. They find that some speech acts, for example, orders associated with, at the perceptual level, at the production level, are associated with some action units. For example, also like questions are associated with eyebrow movement. And it seems that at least for some action units, perceivers tend to use these action units to infer the speaker's intention. So this is nice experimental evidence looking at the relation between facial expression and speech act. What we wanted to do was to then see if in natural conversation people actually use these speech acts in relation to these facial expressions in relation to speech acts. And that's because, so related to the fact that speakers or hearers, listeners, should be understanding how do they understand the speaker's meaning by looking at illocutionary indicating devices. The type of devices that is used perhaps maybe indicate what the speaker wants to convey, but it's not clear whether using linguistic devices actually fulfills the issue of honesty and authenticity, meaning that you can, of course, commit verbally to a course of action, but it's not clear because the speech can be produced very easily. It's not clear whether you actually have the mental state that you can convey in the speech act. And that relates to different to a paper by Green looking at different forms of showing. So a showing that here it means that you provide a cue that is a kind of a logical demonstration of a mental state, and that would be fulfilled by linguistic IFIDs, showing alpha or making the mental states directly perceivable to the hearer, or showing how to giving a cue that enables some kind of representation knowledge. So not a direct perception of the state, but a kind of a representation. Here in this paper, it claims that nonverbal cues could act as or different ways of showing, at least showing alpha or showing how the intention, how authentic the intention is. Okay. So this relates to the question of nonverbal communications, of where speech and face are considered as two components of communication. This model by Barton and Marler suggests that there could be two possibilities where facial expression and language could be redundant, and facial expression and language not be non-redundant. The study I will present after, we are looking at whether there's redundancy between the speech act and the facial expression when we look at different levels of the speech act. I think I'm getting a little slow here, so I will skip these two slides, and I'll go directly in describing that quantitative case study. So our objective was to investigate relationship between language and facial behavior, and our two research questions were whether facial behavior covaries with speech acts in a redundant fashion, and to find out about the speech act properties that covary with facial behavior. The reason there is that speech acts have multiple properties, and they could be connected to facial behavior, to facial expression, with just one or the other property. So the three properties we look at is the illocutionary force, so the general category of the speech act. We are looking also at the valence of the speech act, whether it is positive, negative, or neutral. And that's because valence and facial expression have been very much connected or very much studied. We also look at the strength of the speech acts. So with this, we refer to the idea that people use speech or use different forms of speech to modulate their intentions. So the context of our analysis is a public confirmation hearing of the U.S. Senate when a person, a nominee to a position in the U.S. public administration, is being interviewed by the Senate. It's a 3-hour long video where we code speech acts with, we code that manually with Elan, And we also code facial expression, facial behavior with the face reader. We look at 20 action units. We also look at emotional impressions, valence, and arousal. I will not present the results with the emotional impressions here. But if you are interested, I can talk to you about this later. So what we segment this 3-hour discussion into speaking turns, and we categorize each speaking turn into a speech act. And then once we have all the speech acts, we classify each speech act in terms of illustrative force, so whether it's representative, expressive, directive, or commissive, whether it is positive, negative, or neutral. And we based on the literature by Searle and van der Weken, we assign some illocutionary strength to each speech act. We also do code, as I said earlier, facial expression. We use the facial action coding system, and we do some data processing in order to clean the signal, then filter the signal so we have a nice continuous signal throughout the interaction. And our unit of analysis is the speech bout. How we analyze the relationship between speech acts and facial behavior, we look at confidence intervals around the median. So for speech acts that are for different categories of speech act. And we also do a frequency analysis and a chi-square analysis. All data processing was done in our studio. So our outcome variable is looking at we have two variables, like the presence absence of an action unit. That's for the frequency analysis, and we look at the maximum value for each action unit per speech bout in relation to these 3 different classifications. Okay, so our results. So this is looking at the relation between facial behavior and illocutionary force. So here is the graph you see here. On the left-hand side, you see the facial arousal. So that's the overall facial activity. And on the left side, the negative valence. So that's what face reader gives as negative valence. And that's mostly, it's a value that's computed from all the different emotional impressions except happiness. So the happiness impression is related to positive valence, all the others to negative valence. So the first result is that we see that representative speech acts, at least our target engages in representative speech act, their facial expression are a lot lower than in the other speech acts. But representative speech acts seem to be higher on negative valence. And when we look at more specific action units, the relation between specific AUs and the illocutionary force category, we see that different AUs seem to be significantly associated with different speech act categories. Namely action unit 1 and 2, so that's a brow raiser. And then we have the inner brow raiser and brow lower, action 1 plus 4, and AU12, lip corner puller, AU15, lip corner depressor, show association. So here, this is the result of the chi-square analysis. We see, so for each action unit has a line, each column is a different speech act category. We see is that there's more. So perhaps I can explain how this is done. So we do identify the moments of the video when the action unit is present or absent. And over the whole video, we compute the frequency of the distribution of the speech act when the action unit is present versus when the action unit is absent. And we run a chi-square test of homogeneity that compares the distribution of speech act when the AU is present versus when it is absent. You see the little green dot on the graph is the expected frequencies. What we see, for example, is that so there's more directive speech act than expected when action unit 1 plus 2 and action unit 1 plus 4 and action unit 12 are present. Action unit 12 is not on the graph. And there's more expressive speech act when, oh yeah, it is, action unit 15 and action unit 12 are present. So it seems here that different action units relate to different speech act, but some action unit actually relate to two categories of speech act. So when we look at the valence of facial expression and the valence of speech acts, see there's less connections. We thought that there would be more connections between speech act valence and face, since the face is well known to communicate like psychological valence. What we find is that action unit 4 seems to be associated with a negative speech act, which actually goes in the direction of psychological literature. And action unit 5 seems to be inversely associated with a positively valenced speech act. That these are the only two action units that show associations with speech act valence. So in a nutshell, here the four negative speech act are a lot more frequent than expected when action unit 4 is present, and action unit 5, when action unit 5 is present, there's a lot less positive speech act than expected. Now looking at the relation between speech acts and elocutionary strength, there seems to be a bit more connections there, where we have 4 action units are connected to the speech act strength. So that's AU1, AU1 plus 4, AU5, and AU12. So the inner brow raise seem to be, so when the inner brow raise is present, there's less weak speech acts than expected, more strong speech acts than expected. The pattern is different from action unit 1 plus 4 and action unit 12. Well, when these two action units are present, there seem to be more weaker speech acts than expected. And when action unit 5 and 12 are present, the frequency of primitive speech act seems to be higher. And the frequency of weak speech acts is lower when the action unit is absent. Action unit 5 and action unit 12 seem to be going in the same direction for these type of comparison. So when we look at the strength of the speech act. So the summary, we find that facial arousal is significantly lower when the person engages in representative speech acts, but directive and expressive speech acts seems to have like a higher level of facial arousal. And negative emotions are more frequent also in representative speech acts, where we see that directives show an association with eyebrow movements, like eyebrow raises, and eye opening or eye movement seem to be associated with commissives. But lip corner movements, like AU12 and AU15, seem to be associated with both directives and expressives. We don't find a lot of association between speech act valence and facial expression. contrary to our expectations. And there seemed to be more association between action units and the strength of the elocutionary force. So, of course, this is very preliminary data. That's just one.
Sorry, your talk is already over 1 hour.
Yes, I'm done. Quasi.
No, please wrap it up, please.
I'm wrapping it up. Yeah. It seems that so the conclusion there is that the sincerity conditions of directives and expressives perhaps require access to the speaker internal states. That's how we explain why then these action units, these speech acts are associated with facial expression more. And in general, there seem to be more facial activity during performatives than during constative utterances, which basically supports the idea that facial expression is used in order for social influence perspective, a point of view, or social goals implementation. Good. So there are limitations, but I will not go too long in there. I think more experimental data should be collected, and data about more individuals in more situations. But this is promising findings in relation to looking at facial expression with speech. Okay, I will stop here, and perhaps we can have a discussion then, rather than me speaking a bit more. Thank you for your attention. Sorry for having been a bit too long.
Thank you for your very insightful talk.
Thank you.
Let's hear Professor Piotr Sadowski from Trinity College of Dublin. He's professor of film and creative media.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you, Marc, for making us aware of how complex, fascinating the science of the human face is, which is, to me, something of a natural miracle. We are talking about only a few square inches of surface, but from a human point of view, the human face is probably the most interesting object in the entire universe. And our interest in human faces appears to be, as you pointed out at the beginning, ingrained in human nature. It's inborn. Indeed, there are deep evolutionary reasons for making us aware to other faces, identifying people, their emotions, their intentions, their motivation, their personalities. Newborn children, less than 1 hour old, recognize in their surroundings a pattern of the human face, not necessarily natural face, but psychologists have demonstrated that an arrangement of a schematic human face with two horizontally separated eyes, the mouth, the nose, something like cheeks and chin, ears would be probably optional. They immediately attract attention, as indicated by the infant's eye and head movement. So it's fascinating, and my area of interest is visual arts and film and drama, and obviously the human face as part of the most important element of body language features there prominently. I have a question. I don't want to ramble for too long. Have you come across in your research, and do you know any indication about possible gender differentiation in the perception of of emotions and facial expressions? I remember coming across research done by Simon Baron Cohen, who found some statistical differences in favor of infant girls and then young girls and women generally, the female sex, being better at reading human faces, interpreting emotions, as part of perhaps greater sensitivity, which Simon Baron-Cohen argued was also innate, again statistically, in women and in the female humans, in relying on facial communication, and actually girl infants as well as women in general, and that seems to be across cultures, tend to smile more. Have you found any confirmation about that? In related problem, which has to do with the evolutionary differences in human anatomy, among the hominids, females seem to have lost facial hair, and the consequence of that, the reasons for that is one thing, but the consequence of reduction of facial hair in women is the exposure of more face surface and the opportunity to communicate more. Is that are those two things related? The greater sensitivity of the female gender to facial expressions and that anatomical difference, the reduction of facial hair. There are a lot of other problems and questions I would like to ask, but just this one, because I don't want to take too much time.
Thank you very much. Let's hear now Devon Schiller from the University of Vienna, who is working on semiotics of psychological science.
Thank you, Mark. It was a great pleasure to hear you talking much more than we've had the opportunity before about your work and especially the currently finalizing project. A couple mixed points and then also questions specifically related then to semiotic concerns. First, a theoretical point. In terms of the theories of emotion, now this debate has been going for 150 years in terms of basic emotion theory, and I'm curious what your sort of conclusion is with it, where, at least in my experience, it feels so much like a series of straw man fallacies of different researchers taking one piece of another's and then taking that to the extreme absurdity. Not to be an Ekman proponent or defender or the opposite, but at least in all the first research, it never suggests basic emotion theory as the one and only. And I wonder how much these are set up as mutually exclusive things when, from a semiotic perspective, it's all of them combined. And of course, logically, it would be that one sign can be almost infinite things depending on the context. Similarly, a concern in terms of method, one of the models you presented was this appraisal sequence model. And of course, so much of the studies today rely on automated facial behavior analysis that extract only at apex. And so, I mean, out of context. Not the studies in the lab usually, but the studies that are done societally and that are done in terms of agencies, governments, cognitive marketing, neuromarketing, these kind of areas. And I'd be curious what your feeling is when essentially it's taking a sign out of its context and how much that can harm overall the science. And then just briefly, two semiotic things really leapt out at me that you said. One, expression not of affect, but of action. I thought that was a beautiful reframing of the notion of expression and the definition of that term, but also action as potential action. And so what leapt to mind, of course, was the visual models of Peircean infinite semiosis, or what Eco calls, the chain of semiosis, where if I'm expressing, wondering how someone else is reacting, I see that reaction, I shift my expression, I see them react again to that, I shift my expression again. And so I'm constantly evaluating and reevaluating my potential action based on those present responses. And that strikes me as, from a temporal standpoint, an extraordinary thing of how constantly not only is it shifting, but we're mutually interpretant and interpretant and interpretant and interpretant. And another thing that leapt out was the way you spoke of just behavior as an interface. And there I'm thinking more in terms of Innenwelt and Umwelt, the outer environment and the inner environment models. And I'm curious, do you know studies of facial behavior, not of people in social interaction, but just on their own? I mean, how much does this differ when we're trapped on a desert island and there's no humans around? Are we still behaving in these ways? If we're watching a film alone rather than in a group, if we're, these kind of dynamics, but also if we're injured or ill and we cannot behave in these ways, does that harm not only then the interface to the outer world, but what extent does it harm the interface to the inner world, where there's impacts on empathy and affective cognition simply from diseases or disorders of face, where we cannot process our own inner world through that modality. So those are a mix of things that leapt at me and then questions.
Oh, thank you. Let's hear Ellen Crowley from the University of California, Santa Barbara, who's a specialist in nonverbal communication.
Thank you, Monica. And there was a pleasure, Mark. It's always nice to hear about facial expression, and especially I appreciate that you were one of the handful of researchers that in the bifurcation between psychologists and ethologists, you took the path of ethologists and decoupled expressions from the assumption they are emotions, conveying affect, and you followed that path into a new way, interesting path that you ended with the language connection and testing different hypotheses, and that was marvelous. So thank you very much, Mark. I have a couple of questions. I'll try to be as brief as I can, not to bother the rest. And you are taking notes of the many questions, and I've been in that role, and it's complicated to answer them all. So I want to build from what Devon said. And I've studied facial expression for like 10 years, and it's a headache. So when you collect all the data, all the results, all the theories, all the approaches, it's wonderful. You see all the little pieces, but when you put them together, it's like, this one is from a different thing. They don't match. This is a train. This is the sky. This is what the hell? This is a flag. They don't match together. And I'm like, okay, we should build a theoretical, unified, coherent framework, but this doesn't fit all together. So as someone with decades of experience as you, what do you think would be the future of our theoretical discussions? What do you think about that? Should we aim for one single unified theory, or should we move into testing multiple of them into different experimental designs? I don't know, but you have a hint based on your case study, and that's my second question. You test 3 competing hypotheses, as I've seen correctly, to identify the best explanation for facial expression in an ecological body interaction. But if I heard correctly, it was in a political context speech, like a monologue, was it? Okay, so could you elaborate a little bit more about the implications of your finding, both conceptually for theory construction, as well as practically? What are we learning about facial expressions in this context, in the way you measure it? And all the other questions, I will send them to you by email, but thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Let's hear Federico Bellentani from the University of Torino. He's working on a project on face aesthetics in contemporary e-technological societies.
Thank you very much, Monica, and thank Mark for your insightful lecture. I'm happy to be here also with Professor Remo Gramigna. In the past years, we have taken part in a project on the semiotic of the face called Facets. Today, I am part of a spin-off from this project that is looking at the digital aspect of the face. And I would like to ask you a little bit more about that. First of all, just a brief comments to contextualize also, our work, our presence here somehow. Together with the Facets Research Group, we have divided this research object, the face, that has taken multifaceted ways of research in our research group, as of course the public interface for interaction, the surface for perception, and so on and so forth, but also a more semiotic instance we also consider as a text through which we negotiate identity, which can be indeed then manipulated by us as authors, to be read in a certain way from to the readers. And then we divided this into three semiotic aspects. Specifically, we have for sure the biological aspect with the face and the visage. Then we have the social cultural layers shaping the public interface, what we have called the visus, and then the mediating interface through which we express emotion, what we have called the vultus part. You focus very much in this last part, and you add, and I guess this is for us called the pragmatical aspect of it, especially in the first part, on the theoretical part, when you speak about behavior. So how can you behave through your face? You can negotiate and communicate identity through your face, and this is very interesting for us. And you show us also very interesting and somehow you reconstruct an historical path of research experiment ended up also with your research. Coming to today and to the question then, what we are in a context where a face of anyone can reach millions of views in a second, right? Where social networks are very much based on discourse, on emotion, and on faces as well. So much that some old ones still have the name face on their brand. What do you think is the role of the face within the digital context, the digital realm, and how do you think that the role and the meaning and the face are reshaped today through indeed social network, digital photography, digital filtering, augmented and virtual reality, generative AI, guns, and so on and so forth? Because I think this is is already impacting a lot, not only your research, but all the sciences of the faces that you today show us. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Now let's hear Remo Gramigna, also from the University of Torino, who works with facial semiotics about lying and deception and also other cultural studies.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. And thank you, Marc. I wasn't acquainted with your work, so thank you very much for this. I learned a lot today. I'll be very brief. I think my overall probably to the last point in your outline. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Which basically has to do with how your research cashes in the overall, let's say, implications in the theory of semiotics. So how do you see your work can be a reflection on semiotics? Because you also mentioned the idea of developing a sort of an affective semiotics. So I'll be very happy to hear a little bit more about this term. What do you mean by affective semiotics, and how can your research be, let's say, of benefits for us? Other additional issues for me are the following. One was already raised by Federico, so I'm not going to repeat it, which is about the mediation that facial expressions and facial behavior has through screens, through digital platforms. So that's already been asked by Federico. I was also struck by your keywords. I think one of the keywords in the beginning was behavior. In the first slides, we do not hear much about behavior, at least in our field of studies, which is semiotics. But this said, to my knowledge, there is only one scholar within our own field, semiotics, which has dealt with behavioral, let's say, approaches, which is Charles Morris, and strangely enough, has been completely forgotten in today's world. So I was wondering whether you could spend some word on explaining us how this concept could be still of value for us. And thirdly, just one curiosity. When you talk about the perception mechanisms, I was wondering whether you have found whether these mechanisms apply to all people instinctively, or whether there are differences, say, in subjects that display, for instance, skills of being super recognizers, basically. So whether this can be a general basket in which everybody fits in, or whether you have found differences in people with special skills. Thanks.
I want to thank all the panelists for their questions and remarks. And before I give the word over to Marc, I want to ask a question too. How can artificial intelligence help your research? Okay, Marc. Marc?
Sorry, I was busy typing. Well, great questions. Thanks a lot for the feedback. I regret, I realized 1 hour, I thought 1 hour would be enough. It's short, but I will. So I will start with the questions in the order they were asked. So first with Piotr. Thanks for the nice feedback. You asked about possible gender differences in facial expression, perception, also in the production. And yes, this has been a big topic in my research. Actually, having an evolutionary psychology background, evolutionary psychologist, I really like to look at gender and sex differences for the reason that men and women have evolved, or males and females have evolved different reproductive strategies, and that kind of relates to then the way they lead their social interactions. And since I claimed that facial expression is a tool, or is an important tool in managing social interaction, there are sex differences in the perception and in the control of facial expression. Now, it's like with every domain of sex differences, the sex differences are not like huge, but there are some. So I did research that during my PhD, and more recently in a study. Usually, women's expression, at least the positive expressions, are perceived as being more positive than, say, men positive expression. So if you're a man and you go out and smile to a stranger, their response will be probably a lot less positive than if you're a woman and you go out and smile to a stranger. We find differences in social perception, so differences in the effect of smiling, or sex differences in the effect of smiling, whereby female faces with a smile kind of are perceived more positively on a range of dimensions. And this is not clear whether this is, I mean, yes, it is clear that it is due to the sex, because we do have studies where we have perceptual studies where we control for the intensity of expression. In everyday life and in other studies where we use dynamic stimuli, it seems that women produce somehow higher quality expressions than men. But this is just, I mean, perhaps on average, meaning the mostly skilled, the most socially skilled women will probably beat the more socially skilled men, and if you go down to the other extreme, that would probably be true too. But there's a lot of overlap. You have, of course, men who are extremely socially skilled, extremely charismatic, and then you have also women who are a bit less socially skilled and charismatic. Now, the evolutionary reasons for that, it seems to be that because of the differences in reproductive strategies, it seems that females depend a lot more on social network and social connections, and therefore benefit more from close relations. And since emotional expression, facial expression is related to the formation of bonding and friendship, there will be a more of a pressure for females to be more socially skilled. There was you were wondering whether this was related to the loss of facial hair. That's a good question. I never thought about that, but from what I recall, and I don't know all the studies, but from what I recall, the loss of facial hair is more connected to sexual signals or the loss of hair in general. I mean, we lost our hair not only on the face, but also a bit everywhere in the body. And I believe that would be more connected to, say, tactile communication rather than visual communication. But it is true that, say, the culture has kind of caught up on that morphological feature, and that perhaps has made it a visually important signal. If you look at all the money that people spend on cosmetic to basically look visual, to have the skin look visually appealing, it suggests that bare skin is also playing a role in visual communication. Especially like the color. I know of a study where there was a study conducted in the UK where they were looking at nutrition and how eating more vegetables, among other things like carrots and pumpkins, improves the appearance of the skin. And the skin color, so the visual aspects of the skin are therefore important signals also to communicate, say, for example, health status. Yes. So I wouldn't say completely, but I think there might be connections between loss of facial hair and
And there's the whole area of artificial cultural enhancements of the face and its expression, makeup, cosmetics, and it's a separate area entirely, and as well as semi-permanent modifications of the face in the form of makeup, as well as permanent modifications, plastic surgery, etc. Which is culture itself. That there's nothing, if you like, natural about it. It's all culture, but it can alter not only the shape of the face, but also emotional expression. The problem just gets broader and broader. Yeah.
Since you mentioned that there's evidence, or at least indirect evidence, that, say, Botox use is detrimental to kind of social and emotional life. Even though you'd look to have less wrinkles, so because the Botox paralyzes your facial muscles, you develop less wrinkles. The skin will appear perhaps like more smooth, but it could have consequence on your expressivity, and we know that facial expressivity is usually socially positive. Like people are trusted more when they're facially expressive, etc.
Thanks very much, Mark.
Thank you for your question. Thank you.
I suspect that
was it enough?
Sorry.
Was it enough
Oh
answering?
yeah. No. It
Was
just it pointed me in a new direction, which
Great.
is just as broad as the area that you covered in your main presentation. But I also suspected that the main suite of facial expressions would be common to all people, different genders, different ethnicities, races. The overlap is what matters ultimately.
So in terms of production, there is of course a big overlap between people.
Yeah.
But now the details, like the dynamics, the velocity, the overall expressivity will differ between people.
All the subtleties, yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Mark.
Thank you. So I will address Devon's question. Thank you, Devon, for your feedback. So yes, I like regarding theories of emotions, trauma and fantasy, you're completely right. This seems to be a property of human beings to fight, to compete, and that's also in academia. It is so. My general attitude is, even though I think, yes, science is built up on conflict and controversy, that's like it's perhaps a positive aspect. My general attitude is that I'm trying to take, because I don't think any one theorist is either completely right or completely wrong, and I try to, a bit like in other areas, try to see, okay, what can we keep, what is good, and perhaps find a common ground between the theories. Like, of course, Paul Ekman has been criticized since now 30 years plus, and but I think there are still interesting aspects in his theory. Perhaps not the full. I would not buy the full basic emotion model or discrete emotion model, but I would also not reject it completely. I still think, and that relates to another question you asked. I still think that there are strong connections between, say, some aspect of our internal state, be it whatever emotion actually means, but automatic push factors that are instinctive and that we never get rid of, and that can even come out when we are alone, when we are thinking about stuff. Of course, because thoughts and mental imagery, like is in human, is big. I mean, imagination. You can produce in your head the stimuli that will lead to emotional experience, and the best example of it is the multi-million-dollar movie industry, where people are capable of going into roles that look real. Yes. So they're expressing on one's own that I don't find this abnormal, and I also don't find this would be say a contradictory finding to the social, like kind of social tool, social influence theory. There's actually Friedlund himself speaks of imaginary audience, and how this can influence like facial expression. Of course, nobody will be there to see it, and if you go into a psychology lab, even if you're left alone in the room, perhaps you think there's a camera, somebody at the end of in the control room looking at you. So, but yeah, perhaps completely alone, you may, start smiling, start frowning while recollecting some experience, while thinking. So yes, I don't know about many studies, but mostly I would say probably anecdote. And I wonder how to do a good study about that. Like that would probably have to be self-report or have some kind of camera, but then when there's a camera around, some kind of observer, you ruin the alone condition. The appraisal thing was modeled. So I don't know. Like, I didn't quite understand what you mean by like automatic systems extract mostly action units at their apex. Do you want to?
That's sure. I mean, certainly like how you use Notice as Face Reader and how most psychology or neurology labs use it. It's in time. So it's dynamic and it's from video. But in terms of the commercial implications and the governmental uses of the similar softwares, though Notice, I believe, is designed exclusively for behavioral and psychological research, but other systems, it's extracted at apex or even from photos. So slices of frozen time. And that changes the data entirely. I mean, it's taking a sign, it's a dyadic model that's taking a sign out of any possible contextual embedding.
So working, you mean like working with snapshots of facial expression and out of context? Well, that's no longer, well, I hope it's no longer a topic in psychology, because since now, like a few years or even decades, people have realized that context is essential in understanding facial expression. So you have, I don't know if people would still go and show facial expressions without any kind of context, or even if they do, then yes, you can always get a response from your participants, but what's the value of this response? What's the ecological value of this response? It seems that perceivers try to take, so in addition to what they see on the face, the circumstances, so who is showing the face, in which context, and if they don't have this information, they probably imagine it, or I don't know, they would take perhaps the experimental situation, try to understand what the experimenter wants to find out, etc. So I think like all future facial expression research should take definitely the context into account, and more so people who apply that research to practical problems, like you mentioned, like security. You cannot just like take a snapshot of a person at an airport and say, yeah, he's a terrorist. I mean, based on just the facial expression, it doesn't make sense. But if you have intelligence, if you have, you know what the person has been doing until then, what they'll do, what they're being asked, something specific, etc., you can gradually come up with like more informed perception of somebody, the facial expression just being one piece in the puzzle.
Thank you so much, Marc.
The theories of emotion. I think there will be new theories of emotion. There will be. I'm personally not satisfied with what's currently on offer, and but everyone has to work together to come up with a more sensible, rather than just like fighting each other. I mean, you see, people's careers have been based on attacking, other people's theories, not. So that it's a bit counterproductive, this conflict. Okay, I'll pass on Alan's question. So thanks, Alan, for your feedback, and thanks for being there so early in the morning. I guess especially I recall when I give talks in the morning at Webster, it's quite a pain. So I remember for the audience. So I empathize with you. Yes, facial expression research is a headache. I so I was trying in my talk to be a broad and mention different theories. I only work in some one or the other area. I did a bit of research on emotion perception, but mostly I try to look at the function. So look at like film people, like contextual influences and consequences of the behavior. Also in perceptual experiments, where rather than asking like, oh, what emotion do you feel there, or what is it does that person feel, try to find like maybe more functional aspects, like ask, would you do a favor to that person, etc. This kind of data I think is needed, because there's been too much studies on just like asking about putting an emotion label on a face. If you are interested in facial expression, just keep working on it. And yes, it's complicated also because we are now people are not trying to bring, like, say, a multimodal perspective with looking at the voice, like the body, language, etc. So if it gets too complicated, you need to find collaborators to help with data processing, data collection, experimental design. And because alone, I hope you're not alone, but alone is difficult because there's just too much data, too much relevant data that needs to be collected in order to make sense of something.
That's great. I've read your work with most Malice on the database construction and agreement, disagreement cues. And I like that functional perspective of facial expression, which is the one that is actually the most ecologically valid. And when you go into the literature and you have all the photographs, you have yeah, that's a picture of anger, that's a picture of fear. But when you go to the real conversations, I don't see that stereotype expression anymore. So I
Exactly.
like the approach, and I think that collaborations for testing this hypothesis and functional ideas are vital. So thank you for that. Sure.
Cool, thanks. That you had a question about the implications for practice. The one area where I try to look at now is using nonverbal behavior or facial expression to understand, for example, mood disorders, like as nonverbal indicators of perhaps like mood disorders, or but that's something that I'm really stepping into. I have not big experience there. In politics, there is of course a big. I mean, there's a big. I mean, it's very important. People are trying in political science now at all of facial expressions in political discourse. How do politicians use their face to rally followers, to present themselves? That there's been a bit of research there. When I'm not sure that being aware that politicians use science or communication tactics will help people vote better, because well, everyone kind of knows, like most, at least major politicians have like communication experts to basically counsel them or plan their strategies. I'd be interested in finding out more about the automatic perception, and how can that automatic perception, how can it be modulated or regulated? Even though, I mean, you know that social psychologists, you cannot prevent stereotypes from happening. They're kind of automatic. What can be do about it is to regulate it, or to understand and reduce their importance in future decision. So my hope is that people can do that also when they have preferences for politicians who are just good communicators but who have nothing in their program. But we're also having issues here in Austria regarding politics. But I think that's a bit everywhere. But there's interesting research group, not among others, in the University of Amsterdam. They start looking at political communication and looking at nonverbal behavior, emotion, in this direction. I don't recall the name of the professor doing that, but there's a group there that mixes psychologists and political scientists. That would be a nice thing to look at if you are interested.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Marc.
Okay. Federico, thank you for your questions. I like, of course, I mean, speaking, I was talking about politics now. It is relevant also to, like, you're looking at the use of the face in the media space, and what are the implications for the digital world. This I have not researched the role of the face, say, in mass communication, but I can just, well, there's two things I want to say about that. So first of all, people are very sensitive at the quality of signals, so the quality of expressions. And in my experience, the more computer mediated you are, or the more medium intermediate, like in between signaler and perceiver, the more you deplete the quality of the signal. And it's not because, I mean, of course you can try to reproduce the dynamic of the signal. In fact, evolution of technology points towards the idea that technology has to be as similar as face-to-face interaction. Yeah, so rather than just like writing each other letter, now we can speak. At least we have the dynamic, we have the screen, and perhaps the next step will be to recreate a 3D avatar of your communicator who sits somewhere in Australia or something. So there is this idea that communication technology wants to kind of simulate, at least as closely as possible, like face-to-face communication. And my opinion about that is that it's because they want to increase signal quality. Receivers are very resistant to manipulation, and they are very sensitive to subtle cues. But that's not always the case. So there is a potential for the use of communication in mass media that is fairly perhaps manipulative, or that is there to produce social influence. But perhaps training or exposure helps habituate to, for example, like deceptive messages. That's now you talked about also technology available to modify the face. Yes. Were you mentioning, for example, like fakes, like video fakes, where you could have somebody's expression ported to another person's face, and in a video, like you could see it's that person's, but that would probably be, I guess, some of the more recent technology regarding face manipulation. Yeah, that's a danger. My take is that there are still some hurdles that the technology is not capable of breaching, and that's the dynamics. So, like from a static perspective, you can produce very nice looking images, and AI is of course a great tool for doing that. But with like ecologically valid dynamic stimuli are still quite difficult to produce, or unless or perhaps there are aspects of technology I haven't seen yet, but from what I've seen, like AI generated videos are still like very gross, and you can basically just say it's a fake. And if you pay attention to like other like deep fakes or even better done videos, I think you can still find some weird aspect that points towards being fake. But yeah, that's a future like challenge for societies, both from the media perspective, like so how to produce the most efficient stimulus or the most efficient face, and how to prevent this from being misused.
Thank you. I guess so, because I totally agree with you, which we are still in a sort of transition, but on the other hand, for example, our research on the elderly demonstrate that for them it's not necessarily quite obvious when they see a deep fake. So that's something that we should consider. My question indeed was just, let's say, a hint just to for future discussion. I was just looking for indeed your opinion. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. That brings me to Raymond's question, because I think you mentioned individual differences. Are the perceptual mechanisms are they the same in all people? Not at all. So, and that's an area of research, or psychological research, that's been a big in that most when people do rating studies about face perception, all the raters are averaged, and they are believed to just produce say that the average is supposed to reflect like the prototypical raters perception. But there are individual differences, and so there are sex differences first of all, but then also personality differences. Some people are more sensitive to certain facial cues. Some people are blind to some cues. So, and yes, of course, like there are developmental also there are developmental factors. Like you can see this as you know, a big fluctuation over time. So yes, that's so the individual differences will take more importance in future research, hopefully. There are statistical methods now that have been developed to look at both, like variation both in stimuli, variation in also in radar. So that should be the future, I hope. The implications for the theory of semiotics. Yes, I had a couple of slides about that towards the end. So how does behavior, why is behavior relevant to something that's very mental and cognitive after all, like meaning making sense, etc. I think that so my take on it is it's like we assign meaning to a number of things, and with facial expression, people have focused mostly on the reference as being like internal processes, and that's what makes it a difficult topic of research, because we can never really measure that reference and see if indeed it is a ground truth for the study of facial expression. I think my take is in the facial expression. So first of all, we could qualify most of the psychological research as affective semiotics. So because people like psychologists, main question they've tried to answer was what's the meaning of facial expression. It seems we are driven towards finding meaning. That seems perhaps an innate thing, an innate property of our cognitive system, is like to make sense of things. Regarding facial expression, there was one thing that interested me, is that it has a range. So the range of production mechanisms, so going from very instinctive, perhaps biological instinct, to a very controlled, like symbolic type use of facial expression, is for the same behavior, say smiling. you can smile, and it can mean lots of different things, depending perhaps on the production mechanism. So you can have a smile that's out of pure joy or happiness, but you can also try to please somebody and have the production mechanism there would just be like perhaps socially strategic goals. Or perhaps you want to mean something with your smile. So smiling can also be used in an ostensive fashion, like language. And so what I find interesting, I think in the future, people will look at that a lot. I mean, should look at that a lot, is how facial expression can complement some aspect of symbolic communication that language cannot really achieve. For example, we have thousands of words in each languages, but there are still some things which granularity we cannot explain, other perhaps than maybe making a face, and the ability to control a face perhaps allows the communication of this fine-grained nuances in our mental state that we cannot do with language, but we can perhaps do it by moving our face, say, voluntarily. So I think there's a lot to do in this direction, and that's where I see the connection. So affective, like semiotics, like based on emotional meaning, so to say, or where emotional meaning goes from, say, like a natural perspective, like a Gricean perspective, where facial expression, psychobiological causes is actually the meaning, the natural meaning, to a more kind of symbolic, culturally agreed upon, and even not necessarily culturally agreed upon, but even socially agreed upon. Say, for example, if you have friends you may develop your own communication language with them, like your own words, etc., but also maybe your own expressions. And that perhaps makes the communication richer, like bringing face and facial signals into it. I don't know if this answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot for that.
I do not know Charles Morris, but I will look him up.
No worries about that. No worries. Cheers.
Now Paul wants to make
Yes, I am sorry. I have to make a brief announcement. You may have noticed on Smart Semiotics that I am in the process of developing with my IT team a new platform called Semiotics Commons, which is designed to organize international conferences distributed in space and time, that is over a period of 2 or 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, which will allow people from all parts of the world to take part in it. And the first one will be organized and will take place in the late spring, I hope. And the topic will be the brain on narratives. The brain on narratives. I know that Marc has already agreed to give a keynote on that topic. But I would like also to suggest that the second topic, which could be in the fall, would be a problem which I have considered and which is very difficult to deal, and which pertains to today's webinar, answering the question, what is a sexy face? And it's not easy because, of course, sexiness is in the eyes of the beholder. But there are also some universal features, I believe, and we could work on that both using semiotics, psychological, all sorts of data, because it's a topic which is sort of taboo in a way. Because anybody talking about that is bound to disclose something about their own life. And so it is very difficult, but I think we should try to meet that challenge in a scholarly, scientific manner. and I will welcome any suggestions that you may want to make. The idea would be to have a colloquium or a conference on what is a sexy face, and to have over a period of 3 weeks, webinar like that with one-man speaker, a keynote speaker, and 2 or 3 submitted papers, because there will be a call for papers. So it will be very large. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much for a most beautiful, most interesting webinar today. Thank you, Marc. I really
Thank you,
appreciate.
Paul.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marc. Exquisite.
We are that because there was Monica the question, but are we done, or what is the?
Well, if you want to answer my question, I will be glad to. It's about artificial intelligence.
Okay. Yes. Did I answer everything from Marie? So yes, how can AI help my research? Well, I do use AI. Somehow the face reader is some kind of artificial intelligence, or at least machine learning based tool to study facial expression. Now, in terms, if you meant generative AI, perhaps the production of stimuli, or more realistic stimuli, perhaps, or not more realistic than faces, but than real faces, but more realistic than, say, the avatar faces that people have been using. So that gives control over the like visual aspects of a stimulus, or auditory aspects of a stimulus. But this is definitely something that is going into to happen in a lot of different groups. I'm in general in favor of the use of AI in research, provided that researchers still keep the control over what they are doing, and they don't just use it to do less work, because that really leads to problematic, I guess, data if AI alone is to conduct a research project. But yes, it can be a fantastic tool, to augment our capabilities in data processing, large data processing, for example. That would be the first area where I would use it.
Thank you. Does anybody else have a comment or a question to add? Well, then I want to thank you, Marc, for this wonderful talk. I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank Paul Buissac for setting up this webinar, and also for Zygmunt for his technical support. So I hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.